We're about to be in for another treat. I say that a lot here, but it feels like we're just filled with so much knowledge and there's so much to gain from the wisdom of others, and we're about to do it again. And this panel is going to be hosted by Patricia Karvelas, who will take stock of the current relationship between Australia's First Nations peoples and the rest of the nation to certainly see what lies ahead. And I'm going to give her the honour of introducing her panellists. So can we please make Patricia feel welcome?
Thank you very much. And how was lunch? Awesome. How good is Garma, right? Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we are so lucky to be today, and thank the Yolngu for being so generous with their country and with having conversations with a wide range of Australians. I'm Patricia Karvelas, I'm a host at the ABC, but I have been passionately covering Indigenous affairs for around 25 years of my career, and it's been a lifelong passion for me. I would love to invite my panel onto the stage now so we can have what I think is a really important conversation, particularly in this point in our time and in the trajectory of our history. Matthew Ryan is the chairman of the Northern Land Council. Make it on the stage, big clap. Marion Scrymgour is the member for Lingiari. Welcome to the stage, Marion. Dr. Josie Douglas is the General Manager of the Central Land Council. And you will know Dean Parkin as the face of the Yes 23 campaign. Welcome to the stage, Dean. Now, as was brilliantly articulated, and if you read the guide to this conference, this panel is meant to take stock of the relationship between First Nations people and the rest of Australia. And I think we've been having lots of conversations informally about where we're at, given the referendum result and what that says about different parts in our country. I want to start, if I can, with you, Matthew, and to ask you, there's obviously a lot of sadness in some parts of the Indigenous community, and I've certainly felt it here at Garma about the result. And the Prime Minister says we shouldn't rake over the ashes. But I do feel like there's been a lack of raking over, and if you don't work out what happened, you can't make decisions about what you might do next. So if I can ask you first to reflect, and I'm not going to spend the whole panel with reflections, but we need to start with some reflections about what you think went wrong, why the vision that you perhaps had for this country wasn't able to be achieved.
Thank you. Before I kick off, look, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country where we are, past, present and emerging, and acknowledging Jawa Yunupingu as one of the leaders of the Gumatj people. Again, thank you, Jawa, for having us here today. And again, look, before we kick off, very strong words from Jawa, and let's reflect on the words that he said, so powerful and meaningful. We need to get our act together as a whole. So thank you. Look, I'll kick off by saying, it was a sad time for all of us as First Nation people, and yes, there was non-Indigenous people that were part of the journey. Unfortunately, being on the working engagement group for The Voice, I was quite saddened. There should have been more education in terms of in the regions that are really disadvantaged. And still today we are facing that. Health, education, and all the other rest, infrastructure, like Jawa said earlier again, the basic needs of our people. This was a great opportunity to get it right for all. Unfortunately, missed opportunity. Back to square one, but I think we shouldn't be reflecting back. Let's move forward. Let's get everyone together as leaders and empower ourselves again. Let's not let the fire die. Let's light it up again. It's about the fire moving forward. So again, it's quite emotional at the time when we lost the referendum.
Marion, keeping the fire burning, what does the fire look like now? It has to be a different kind of fire, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I like Maddie, I'd like to I want to also acknowledge Jawa and the Yolngu people and whose land we're fortunate to gather on. And it's always great to come to Garma, Patricia. I think listening to, there were 3 fantastic speeches here this morning. And I think starting off with Denise Bowden, who, very carefully and systemic, laid out the way forward. And I think that was really important for the message that was in her speech, and for any of us, and I know as the local member, for Lingiari, the federal member, her message was poignant, it was important, and we shouldn't forget what was in that. And I think all of them, then going to Jawa, a former member of my executive when I was at the Northern Land Council, spoke so powerfully. And I think, Yolngu are in good hands with people like Jawa, Yanamul. You see the male and female leaders in this region. It's in good hands, and we know that. But Denise's message was, don't be fooled by the trappings of Garma and what's here either. For some of us, we get to see what that poverty, what those issues are. So I think we've got to take those lessons and make sure that when we're back in Canberra, that we implement the practical measures, all of the measures that the Prime Minister was talking about. And as the chair of the First Nation caucus meeting for the Federal Labor Party, we do need to come up with an implementation plan, that it's not just words that we're talking about, and we just don't leave it to another year of Garma and not come back. So that hurt and that fire that, Denise talked about, that Jawa, that the Prime Minister said, he takes up that challenge. We just need to make sure that it's going to mean something. And I'm looking forward to working with, Malandiri as our new Minister for Indigenous Australians. What a great moment that is for the Northern Territory. And, every Northern Territorian should feel proud that, for the first time, we have a federal minister in this state, and we've got to get the outcomes for, particularly for the Territory.
Dr. Josie Douglas.
Well, I think the result was a significant setback and seriously wounded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Going forward, in terms of, we don't want that wound to continue to fester, and if it does, it's also incumbent on the Australian state, the nation, to do things differently so it doesn't continue to fail Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this country. We heard a lot about the importance and value of fire and regeneration, and that's certainly a theme that we do need to take forward. And what that looks like needs to be determined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our community-controlled organisations, not by government or consultants. We need the space and time to work out what that future may look like. And having said that, a proposal in the future that addresses the issue of constitutional reform should not be taken off the table. It should still be part of a future consideration, but the time frame for that is yet to be determined. Yesterday, Denise Bowden spoke about the importance of breaking the silence. And I think in terms of understanding what happened on the 14th of October is this. W.E.H. Stanner in 1968 spoke about the cult of forgetfulness and the Great Australian Silence. And I think this contributed to the result of the referendum. It's an intentional forgetting of Australia's history and the atrocities that was carried out on Australia's First Nations people. And then with the forgetting becomes a rewriting of history and a choosing to forget, a choosing not to know. And that did play into the result. But of course, ultimately, we may have had a different result if we had bipartisan support. It's as simple as that.
If I can just pick you up on this forgetfulness, is it perhaps something else, though, which is a lack of knowing? Because so many people were reflecting that they were not engaged with this. So when, if you look at this panel's description, it's about seeing how Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia's relationship is. Is it that relationship hasn't even perhaps been established in many places?
Well, after the referendum, there was a week of silence that was called to, and the Central Land Council observed that week of silence. And within that week of silence, I think, was a real, it was grief and mourning. And I think that the relationship with the nation state has never really been dealt with. It's unfinished business. And this is, we heard about the multitude of statements that have been released over many years, the Yirrkala Bark petition, the 1988 Barunga statement calling for a treaty. And ultimately, I think there needs to be a national treaty. It may be a very unpopular thing to say, but there is unfinished business. And self-determination and justice is where we need to be heading. We've got the Closing the Gap National Agreement, we've got the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and those two things go to the very heart of self-determination and justice.
Dean, the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, is it a broken relationship?
Firstly, Jawa, I want to pay respects to you and your people. Thank you for having us here on your country. I bring greetings from my own peoples, the Quandamuka peoples, from Injuriba, North Stradbroke Island. I think there's a disconnect between the relationship. Going back to the causes as to why we weren't successful in the referendum vote, despite the largest political campaign in Australian history, 6.2 million votes. The largest volunteer movement, 60,000 Australians volunteering, many for the first time, supporting the Yes campaign, something that we're very proud of, and I'll get back to that. The reality is, and this is something really important for all of us to understand as we sit here, everybody that comes to Gama, most people that come to Gama, at the very least are open, are curious, and they start at that end and move right through to some of the greatest champions in this country for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the relationship with non-Indigenous people. So we are a particular audience, and it's terrific to be here, I've got to say, being amongst friends and allies and country people. But for many Australians out there, millions of Australians, a couple of things. Very, very low levels of awareness. Despite decades of reconciliation movement, despite the intensity of the Closing the Gap agenda over many, many years, it wasn't until we got to the actual vote in October that the awareness of Indigenous disadvantage across the country got to 50%. The idea that only half the country understood that there was a problem, and that was problematic because we're out there selling a solution that half the country didn't know actually existed. So that's one thing. The levels of awareness are much lower than those of us that spend a lot of time in this space thinking about it. Out there, not many people really know. The second thing, and related to that, is the lack of connection to their own lives, the lack of salience, closeness to their own sense of what's important. And when you add that with things like very real live issues, and I don't need to tell the mob here that there's cost of living problems in Australia, because the mob have been existing with cost of living problems for a very long time. Heightened, amplified cost of living problems. And while it is but it is also a very real consideration for millions of Australians out there at the moment coming into the vote. Even in that last week, this issue of the referendum only ranked about 3 or 4 at the top of the people's list of priorities. Something that we had been advocating for decades and threw everything at wasn't even in the top 3 of people's minds. So it is important for us to understand that when we are advocating change that requires the support of the Australian people, to know that for a lot of Australians, and then as Josie mentioned, the lack of bipartisanship by itself wasn't the issue, but when you add that and an unnecessarily ferocious opposition, let's call that out. It was unnecessary. That level of ferocious opposition to the voice added to that low level awareness and the lack of salience and relevance to people's lives and issues in front of them, like how to pay the rent and put food on the table for their families. That was what really hampered the campaign and ultimately resulted in the loss. That's the non-Indigenous side. As Denise pointed out yesterday, when you look at this heat map that's in the booklet, the GAMA booklet, the Indigenous response, and particularly the remote Indigenous response, was very, very different. I call it the T, right up the middle of Australia and across the top end. And we were told many times by those opposite, oh, the remote people don't know what you're talking about, the bush people don't know what this voice means. Well, the result and the evidence points elsewhere, that the people that would have most benefited from the enactment of a voice and recognition were the ones who voted most strongly yes. And so we have been constantly told since the vote, you must accept the vote. You must accept the result. And we do. We accept the fact that we did not reach the constitutional hurdle to achieve a successful referendum to recognise our mob through the voice. And I think this is very important for particularly how the government thinks about this going forward, we must also accept that there is a democratic mandate that could not be clearer from remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that something needs to change and that needs to be a representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the issues that affect their lives. And we understand that there's been commitments to say that there won't be a national voice as such, but what more do we need? You don't need more consultations to ask the mob what's important to them. You don't need any more studies and reports and royal commissions. We have a historic democratic mandate written in black and white, Maningrida, 88% there, Mr. Chair. Tiwi Islands, 84%. Palm Island, Yarrabah, the list goes on. We cannot discard the democratic mandate that has emerged from remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this issue. It would be unnecessarily conceding more to those that oppose this proposition, and it would be making the referendum result worse if we just brush it over and say, oh, but the mob out bush supported this. Well, we've got to be stronger than that and say there is a direct democratic mandate for this government and future governments to do things fundamentally and structurally different when it comes to the representation of
Dean,
Indigenous people's interests. So, Dean, what does that look like?
Because you make a point which is accurate, that the percentage of support for this model was disproportionately different than in other communities. And so that goes to that relationship. Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia voted differently. So, given that, what is the democratic mandate? Is it for a voice in those communities, are you saying?
Well, you know, we put forward a very strong proposal and, you know, that had the mandate from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to do that through the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I think it is incumbent upon the government to respond to this and to say that whether it is new structures, and that doesn't appear to be on the agenda from what we have heard since. But if it's not new structures, then at the very least, get them behind and provide additional support to the existing representative structures that are there. And they're represented here on this
So you mean
panel.
the land councils?
Well, I think that's a further conversation between. I'm not gonna stand here and prescribe exactly what the solution is, because that is the whole point of letting mob represent their own interests in these things. But I think the main point, Patricia, that I'm trying to make here is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we are to accept the democratic result that did not pass the constitutional majority for an enshrined voice, we must accept. The whole point of the voice was the fact that we say that democracy does not serve Indigenous peoples well as an extreme minority in our own country. And that is true, but we have choices in that too. And the choice we have here is to either brush over and just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, too bad you mob, even though you did exercise your democratic right and vote yes. That's just too bad because everybody else said no. I don't think that's acceptable.
Okay.
And I think there is a responsibility to think about this differently and work with those mobs, at the very least, to work out what strengthened representative structures look like.
Let me put that to Marion, because Marion, you actually have a vote in the Parliament. Is that worth pursuing? Or because we hear about a mandate and that this was a result, and it was a strong no from the country, but not in Indigenous communities. Does that disconnect mean that you can provide a model for representations in those communities?
I think if we look at what happened in my seat in Lingiari, so everyone can imagine somewhere down south you'd have one or two booths. In Lingiari, and getting around and talking about a voice, our push was 195 booths. So we talk about democracy. Aboriginal people exercised their right to make a change, and they did want to change. We did talk to people, and it just infuriates me when I hear the other side saying that Aboriginal people didn't know what they were voting for. But what we've got to also not lose sight of is that 6 million non-Aboriginal people, the country voted with us. And so we've got to, so if we look at what happened last year, Patricia, I think we've got to harness that experience that we went through last year. As a reminder, I think that change, and the Prime Minister talked about this, Linda Burney, when she was the Minister and she was leaving, she was saying, our road is not a straight road. It's often not a very clear road. And so we've got to, incrementally and through universal, national, I think we've got to get some sort of agreement. I am but one vote in a member of 150, and you often see me, during question time, Patricia. But it's important to be able to take the voice of Aboriginal people into our party room. And there is a lot of discussion and there's a lot of debate as well, because, whilst we all want things to be moving in a straight line, our life and our road is not a straight line, and it's what, Josie was talking about. I just want to reflect a little bit when, listening to both Dean and Josie and also Maddie. I think it's really important. So voice, if we put voice to one side, and we've had the referendum, treaty and truth, which is what Dean and Josie were talking about. If we all reflect back, and having been in this political arena for a long time, let's look back at the Mabo judgment and what happened and what was delivered under the Wick decision. Now, let's not lose sight of native title in this country and what native title needs to be delivered in terms of treaty and truth in this country. And we can use that as a means to work through. It needs courage, and I think our Prime Minister, and having been in there the 2 years and knowing the Prime Minister even before entering into Parliament, it took a lot of courage to say, okay, it's not going to be politically palatable to go out there and ask the country to change our constitution. But I gave commitment to Aboriginal people to do that. And I think if we look at native title and what that process can mean, the last time native title was changed was Redfern, was Paul Keating, and there has to be change. If we want change in this country, we do need to talk to, you know, just within government and, you know, there is a lot of discussion about native title.
So you'd like to see native title change?
Well, I think we've got to have a discussion about what is native title. If we go back to the Wick decision, Patricia, and what that meant, that was watered down by Howard, you know, and Howard's 10-point plan. You know, every time it comes to Aboriginal people, governments get a bit weak-kneed and they get a bit wobbly and they think this isn't going to be good for, you know, Sydney or Melbourne or elsewhere. But they don't think about the very people whose lives and livelihoods this depends on. And at some stage, amongst that 6 million, we've got to get that groundswell again, that fire, that renewal, and through that, the strength of Aboriginal people to be able to.
What changes would you like to see in a native title?
Oh, I'm not going to have that conversation here either.
Well, you've just opened up a whole new conversation, and I want to know more.
Yeah, look, I think if all of us, and you've been around a long time, and I
don't
see
rub it in.
David speak, you know, like a lot of people, if you have a look at the High Court judgment and what happened with Mabo and what needed to happen with that, and then it stopped. There were expectations. I mean, I look at the Larrakia and I want to acknowledge, you know, Nigel Brown and the Larrakia people. Now, you know, native title could have been a great thing for Larrakia. I think we can use the treaty process and that to reopen, you know, some of those processes. But, you know, that's my thinking, but they're discussions that we often have.
Josie just wants to respond, and then I'm coming to you, Matthew. I'm trying to balance everyone.
I'd like to make two quick points. In terms of native title, there's an inquiry being conducted by the Australian Law Commission on future acts, and that's a very important process that's underway. In terms of native title, we'd certainly support strengthening and widening the scope of native title holders to negotiate. That's something that needs to be done. In terms of reform to native title, there's a proposal in terms of reforming, I think it's section 56(5), which is of concern to the Central Land Council. And the concern is that if PBC is wound up or deemed insolvent, it could go to native title holders losing their rights and interests forever. So this is something we would oppose very strongly. Let's not forget, tenure is often bandied about as being an impediment to economic development. Under the Native Title Act, you've got the Indigenous Land Use Agreements, which permits the surrender or sale or leasing. Plenty of opportunity there for economic development. Of course, there's some reforms that we would very much welcome, and that goes back to strengthening and widening the scope for native title holders to negotiate. That's very important. But I want to make another point, Chair, if I may, and PK.
I'm being hustled over here.
Yeah, is around structural reform and the way forward and what that looks like post-referendum. Well, I think the missing link in what has happened but could point to a new direction and a solution to going forward is the involvement, the strong involvement of the Aboriginal community control sector. We have the Coalition of Peaks, who's led the way for the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. There's 80, that's a peak body, there's 80 members of ACOs within that. There are 3,300 Aboriginal community-controlled organisations in Australia incorporated under the CATSI Act or the Mainstream Corporations Act. Now, we need to enliven this sector. It's a precious, unique sector to many of us. grown up through the 1970s. That's where self-determination comes about, through the Aboriginal community control sector. What the future looks like post-referendum, I'm going to have to say this, should not be left to government. It should not be left to consultants. It should not be left to the university sector. It needs to be the Aboriginal community control sector. The membership is drawn from the community. And I'm looking at Jawa. The membership is drawn from the community. These organisations are governed by community. Under the Closing the Gap agreement, there's scope for a National Assembly, and the future could be a National Assembly of a broadened number of these Aboriginal community-controlled organisations who've got the time and space to deliberate and consider what the future is post-referendum.
It's really interesting. Matthew, just want to get you on the reforms to native title and land. Do you see that as a pathway forward? And this idea of a National Assembly, of broadening out the peaks?
Yeah, look, as the new chairman of the Northern Land Council, I've visited 7 regions of mine. And a lot of the travels that I did is hearing people. And part of that discussion is native title. And part of the thing, I think what Josie said, Dr. Josie said, the PBCs. We want to give back the PBC back to the traditional owners so that they prosper from their own country or land. I think for far too long, I think, with respect I say to non-Indigenous people here, we want to see our own Indigenous people start to prosper from their own land. We have the resources. And that's what, it's at the stage at the moment, been in the job for what, 5 months? So still getting there, and we will get there. And we will support our TOs regardless. I'm here to support any TOs within my 7 regions. And part of that thing is, looking at the ALRA, the land rights, where, for too long again, our people have been disadvantaged. Take for too long. We're still here talking about it. We need change. Change is now. Let's be on the same page. It's not about us versus them. It's about all of us, especially my people. I'm fed up. We're still behind the 8 ball. We haven't achieved anything. The closing the gap, it's gone stale. I'll be quite frank, it's stale. They use that little word every time when we meet with the government or anybody. It's gone backwards, to be honest. Everyone knows that. As First Nation people, we should be the one who has the solution. We have. We've been talking for too long. Let's make change as a collective. And we need to be serious about this. We have, the government, all government have failed. And as the new chair, I want to see that change. And I want to work with my people.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and we cannot continue this conversation without having a deeper conversation about Makarrata, because the Prime Minister had in his speech that he was committed to Makarrata, but what that looks like, we don't know. He says there'll be conversations at a national level. If we can keep our comments brief so we can... I've got so many things to ask about. The path forward is very big. Dean, what do you want to see? Because there are different models being suggested. The Greens had a model. The government's talking about a very different kind of idea and no timeline. What do you want to see?
Quickly.
Well,
you set me a task here,
I
Patricia.
have. It's true.
So I was remiss not to say it was important and historic that the Prime Minister delivered upon his commitment to hold the referendum. Every other Prime Minister in recent memory has shirked that issue, and he will, regardless of the result, will stand in a very, very high esteem for doing that. That must be said, and we thank him and Marion and members of the government in their strong advocacy for that. The existing commitment that was made, I think the 17th of May 2022 on election night, was implementation of the full Uluru Statement from the Heart. And there is a distinction that has emerged that I think we need to just take a closer look at, which is commitment to Makarrata versus commitment to a Makarrata Commission. Because Makarrata, and I'm not going to speak on it because it is Jawa's and his people's term to fully describe, but in the sense of what it meant in the Uluru Statement was a structural reform. We're talking about a thing that would oversee, as the Uluru Statement says, a process of agreement making between First Nations and truth-telling about our history. So that is the commitment to a Makarrata Commission, because if we start talking about it more broadly as a concept, then it just gets left open to whatever may be. And I will also say that I don't think it is solely within the remit of governments to determine what the mechanisms and processes might be around things like agreement-making treaties and truth-telling. To say that there might not be judicial arrangements, that it is simply a matter for local communities, actually isn't a government call. The idea of how this plays out absolutely must be a process of negotiation, because whoever sets the terms from these processes, they're the ones that exercise the power in which they then are prosecuted. And if truth-telling will do anything, it will show that the history shows that blackfellas have been on the wrong end of that power equation every single time. So the way we get to these processes must be by a process of negotiation, and must be something that is done in a considered way and a structural way, because simply talking about these things won't cut it every time we've made change in this country. It's either been legislative or judicial or some other structural reform, because we need it to buttress from backsliding in future. So I think we've got a way to go on that, and we're not in any way, shape or form giving up on what that full implementation of the Uluru Statement looks like.
Interesting. Josie, do you think...
We've had the most progress in Australia either through litigation or legislation. So just to make that point, I think we welcome the Prime Minister's announcement this morning. We were concerned that it was stepping away from that commitment. We welcome it. Cannot be decided by government. It's the Aboriginal community control sector. There is existing structures in place that can be utilised to determine what a Makarrata Commission would look like.
Okay, the government, you're right, talks about Makarrata, but has not committed to a Makarrata Commission. That is right, Dean. And we know that the opposition is dead against it. So again, there's no bipartisanship on this. Should he press ahead regardless?
Well, we didn't get much idea on what he was thinking this morning in terms of the high-level principles of Makarrata. I think what needs to be done, and we need to press the Prime Minister and Cabinet on this, is, you know, what are they willing and prepared to put on the table? And then, of course, but it's not government having to lead this, and it shouldn't be. It must be the Aboriginal community control sector. We need more detail, otherwise it's kind of a feel-good statement. Nonetheless, that we welcome that commitment, but we need to prosecute what that might look like going forward.
Marion, the government has used the word, not walking away from the word, but the idea is something different.
Yeah,
the government hasn't committed to the actual commission.
Yeah, look, I take what both Josie and Dean are both saying in terms of Makarrata and what does that mean. I think for this country, there has to be a process and clarity. What is it that you know we need to put going forward? But I think that whatever happens, I think it goes to what Josie was saying, Dr. Douglas. Aboriginal people, we ourselves have got to come together. We ourselves have got to heal amongst each other, because unless we do that, and because part of Makarrata is the coming together, and part of that process is in that, which is truth-telling. We do need to have that amongst each other as Aboriginal people, because until we ourselves can walk through that, we're going to have the same divisive campaigns that we've had, and our mob don't want that anymore. We've got to be able to, and this country has to come together. I sit in that chamber all the time when I go to Canberra, and I almost have to walk out at night and then have a hot shower and wash the crap that you're subjected to and what you hear. And, I remember standing on the booth on election day with the referendum, and the saddest and the most heart-wrenching thing that was said to me was by young people, we're voting no because we want black men to stop raping their kids. That's the lies that were said, and we've got to heal this country. We've got to bring people, whether we like it or not, together. There are 6 million warriors out there. We keep saying that, and we need to build on that because we can. Because the forces of evil, I'll be as blunt as Dean, and there is a huge force of evil, and I see it every time I go into the Parliament, and I often think about the Aboriginal people that I represent, and they are good, and they don't talk like how you hear some of the stuff talking, and it does make you angry, but it makes you sad, because you think, if only Aboriginal people heard what was said inside this Parliament, we would probably have World War III break out, but we have to bring it together, Patricia. I think for the good of this country, we have to, because Australia is a good country, and the original owners of this country have to be able to drive that process, and I think only Aboriginal people can drive this. I agree with Josie. I think through our organisations, through each other, we've got to let go of, because we do see a lot of anger, even amongst each other, and we've got to stop that. So I think there is hope for the future. Maybe I'm being a bit idealistic, but, I think, Lingiari, as a new minister, has said she wants bipartisan. The person who campaigned in the No campaign and put out a lot of misinformation and disinformation, I've said to Mel, she's got what our people need, and that's heart and that's compassion. And that's what our people need, and she needs that to go up against, the negativity and the toxic, poisonous, stuff that comes out. But she's got enough heart to be able to go through that, and we need to get behind her, and I'm 100%. I think we can do this. And Dean, I think you and I were probably out of the 250, 300 delegates, Josie, that was part of the Uluru Statement, and there was a lot of hope. Maddie, let's take that. Let's take that hope. We can take that hope.
Maddie, you've got the mic now.
No.
What's next?
Sorry,
Makarrata?
Marion, I'm here too. Look, all we want to say, look, as the chair, I think let's not be the red tapes, and we want to work with the leaders like such, Marion, Josie, and Dean, and other leaders, Jawa and Malindiri. All the leaders are here, Yanamul here, very strong woman. There's a lot of strong women. At the time, so just reminder during the intervention, like what Marion said, we're still reeling in here, the perception that all men are rapists, pedophiles. And I can look in your eyes, you're non-Indigenous people. We're not. We're strong family members, grandfathers. We're not them, all right? We are people. We are people. We're trying to make living as well. We're trying to make changes. But the changes need to come from you lot as well, as non-Indigenous Australians. Work with us, not against. Let's not fail again. Let's do it right this time. Please come together. Let's find a solution. And we have them. We have the right solution moving forward. Achievements like, Blue Mud Bay, sea rights. Other than at the Parliament, raising the Blue Mud flag at the Parliament, great achievement. Recognizing Indigenous people of who they are, where they come from. The fresh meets the ocean. Awesome. The Mararpa people and others, and the Gumatj people here today. We have strong people, strong leaders right across Northern Territory. Again, I'm saying we must work together or else we'll be still behind the eight ball. We will still see incarceration rate climbing. Rheumatic heart still climbing because we're not putting basic essential stuff, laundry mat in the communities. Simple things like that they can wash their clothes every day for the kids. Overcrowding issue, we're still talking about it today. You might as well write a history. We should be writing history about the failures. But in saying that, look, let's not be the red tape for all. Thank you.
I want to thank this incredible panel. Give them another big round of applause. Thank you.